Darwin once told me that if Nobel Prizes were awarded in the fields of geology or astrobiology, Dr. Hazen would already have one. So thank you very much, Bob, for being here and for sharing what I think is a very exciting subject. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all so much for being here. You know, I love fossils. I've collected them since I was this high, and minerals. And they've sort of been with me throughout my career, many decades of which were spent at the Carnegie Institution for Science. But thinking about the evolution of life through fossils, the evolution of minerals, which you'll see, has led to some larger questions. And they're questions that are deeply rooted in the concept of time and the laws that describe and explain time. So think about time. We remember special days. We remember the past. John and Cindy, Stephen, my wife Margie and me. Those are memories that really stick with you. So we think about the past. We remember the past. At the same time, we anticipate the future. You imagine going for that walk on the beach. You imagine what you might find, and once in a while, if you're very lucky, you'll see something special. So think about that. We remember the past. We anticipate the future. But we can only live now. And what is this thing? Now. And now. And now. What is that? As a scientist, what you do is you say, okay, can we come up with some kind of explanatory, descriptive, quantitative, and maybe even predictive statements about the natural world that explains time to us? And so these are the laws of nature. That's what a scientist would do. The natural laws. And there's a group of them. Now we're talking here today about what are called the macroscopic laws. Those are the laws we experience every day in our life. I'm not talking about the quantum effects at the extremely small scale of electrons. I'm not talking about relativistic effects at the speed of light or masses as large as black holes. We're talking about the everyday experience that you have every moment of your day, including while you're sitting here at this lecture. So there's the laws of motion, the laws of gravity, electromagnetism, and laws of energy, also known as the laws of thermodynamics. And the question we need to ask is, are these laws, as they're now codified in textbooks and physics classes and in science classrooms around the world, are they sufficient to characterize all the different familiar phenomena we have in our natural world? And over the last several decades, my conclusion has been no, they are not. And so 3 years ago, at the height of the COVID epidemic, a group of us began to talk weekly on Zoom. We began to read literature and listen to each other's ideas and vocabulary. It's an amazing group of people. Jim Cleaves, the president of the International Society for the Study of the Origin of Life, and Stanley Miller, is the very last graduate student, is an organic chemist. My colleague Anirudh Prabhu at Carnegie is an information scientist. Mike Wong's an astrobiologist. Carol Cleland, Daniel Ahrens, Heather Demarest, they're all philosophers of science at Boulder, specifically philosophers of natural law. Stuart Bartlett's a theoretical physicist at Caltech, and Jonathan Lenine is one of the foremost authorities in the field of planetary science. And together, we tried to tackle this question. So what I'm going to describe to you today is sort of embedded in an article that came out just slightly more than a year ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, called On the Roles of Function and Selection in Evolving Systems. And in this, rather audaciously, we proposed a new natural law. This paper has become a kind of lightning rod. It's been downloaded more than 100,000 times, which is a lot for a scientific paper. And it's created a lot of buzz. Surprisingly, very little of it negative, which surprises us because we're really challenging. We propose that there's at least one additional law of nature that we have to add to the canon that I've just talked about. And so a question you could ask is, what does a missing law mean? And by the way, this particular law we're suggesting represents an arrow of time, which in the canon of natural law is the second one of these. See what I mean? Okay, so what's a missing law? First of all, it has to describe something that's universal, that we all experience, that's part of our everyday lives, that we see all around us. It has to be fully consistent with the other laws of nature because they've been codified, they've been established. So you can't suddenly violate the law of gravity or the law of motion or the law of energy. But this new law cannot follow directly, inevitably, logically from those other laws. It has to be something in addition that's layered on top of what already exists. So here are the laws of nature, and the discovery of each of these laws gives us a hint about how we might approach looking for a missing law. In every case, what you're looking for is something called a conceptual equivalence. You look at natural phenomena that on the surface may appear very, very different, but suddenly in a subtle and deep way you realize they're one and the same. So let me go through some of these conceptual equivalences of nature. And the earliest ones were discovered by Isaac Newton back in the 1620s, I think it was. It's a long time ago. But before he could formulate his famous laws of motion, he had to realize that in the natural world there are only two kinds of motion. And uniform motion is simply an object standing still or an object moving in a straight line at a constant velocity. That's called uniform motion. Now, other people in Newton's day thought that uniform motion also included going in a perfect circle at a constant speed. But Newton said, no, that's not uniform motion, that's acceleration. And everything else, every other motion you can imagine is acceleration. Once Newton realized these two different kinds of motion, he was able to take the next step that any change in motion, any acceleration of any kind requires a force. So this first law is the definition of force, that common term we use all the time. A second law is force equals mass times acceleration. This is an equation you can calculate, and it also is a definition of the word mass. And then the third, and perhaps the most subtle of the laws, that forces always act in pairs. You can't exert a force on something without exerting an equal and opposite force back on you. So these three laws of motion required that conceptual equivalence. And then Newton went on to propose the universal law of gravity, in which he said there's a gravitational force between any two objects. But other people had seen gravity at work on Earth, and they assumed it only applied to the Earth's surface. What Newton realized is that an apple falls when it falls from the tree, but the moon is also falling. It's just that it's going sideways while it falls, so it keeps falling around the edge of Earth, and that's what the orbit is. And once Newton realized that, he was able to come up with this equation. Force equals a gravitational constant, the mass of the one object times the mass of the second object, and divided by the square of the distance between them. So that's the law of gravity. And then we have the laws of electromagnetism, discovered by a number of different scientists in the early 19th century. Here, it's the recognition that electricity and magnetism, which seem very different in their static forms, are two aspects of the same electromagnetic force. Once you recognize that you could take an electric current and make an electromagnet, it led to all kinds of new technologies. For example, the electric motor, the electric generator. And also, when you put these ideas about electricity and magnetism into equation form, something known as Maxwell's equations, you derive that whenever electricity and magnetism changes back and forth, there's a wave-like phenomenon that travels at 186,000 miles per second, and that's light. So you don't need a second natural law for light, because light falls completely logically and mathematically out of the other laws of electricity and magnetism. That's why there's not a separate law of light, for example. And then finally, we have the idea of the laws of energy, called the laws of thermodynamics. And here, before you can make progress, you had to recognize that three very different kinds of phenomena were in fact one and the same. There's potential energy, chemical potential or gravitational potential or elastic potential. We have kinetic energy. the energy of motion, and most subtly, and the thing that took a long time to figure out, was heat. But once you realize that heat and potential and kinetic energy are all different aspects of the same thing, they're conceptually equivalent, then Joule, there we go, Joule could invent his very famous and important experiment where he showed that you can take a weight, gravitational potentially, convert that into kinetic energy of the whirling paddle wheel, and you heat up the water, and they transfer one from another, but the total amount of energy is constant. So that's the first law of thermodynamics. Subsequently, it was realized that there are limitations on how energy can flow from one place to another. So heat always spontaneously flows from a cooler to a warmer body. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And in fact, that second law of thermodynamics is the only one that has an arrow of time. That's not symmetric with respect to going forward or going backward. So here we have an arrow of time. And this was, until very recently, the explanation given in every textbook about what is time. Well, time is just the dissipation of heat energy from a concentrated source, for example, from your brains radiating out into space. And that's how we experience time, because it's directional. Okay, so there are the 4 sets of laws, about 10 or 12 statements in all, mathematical, each of them. Is that it? And we say, no, it's not. Because none of these laws, individually, collectively, either implicitly or explicitly describes evolving systems. It doesn't explain the origin and evolution of life and the origin and evolution of other systems of that sort. And as fossil collectors, many of you know that life has changed dramatically through time, and it's a lawful process. So what is this process? There we go. So here's our starting point. We look around us, and we see evolving systems of all kinds all around us all the time. We see them in the evolution of isotopes and elements and stars. We see it in the evolution of minerals. We see it in the evolution of planets and oceans and atmospheres. Certainly the evolution of life, and also the evolution of technology. These are all aspects of worlds. Now, what we mean by an evolving system is very simply, it's a system that, an evolving system is simply one that becomes through time more complex, more diversified, in a congruent fashion. That is, each step in an evolving system depends on what came before. So you have to go one after another step. And so what we're looking for, is there an explanation of how these evolving systems work? And what we argue is that all of these systems, as diverse as they may appear, are conceptually equivalent in 3 important ways. First, all of these systems are built of components. In the case of atoms, it's protons and neutrons. In the case of minerals, it's atoms and molecules. In the case of life, you can think of it as building of organelles or cells or organs or groups of people getting together in a society, interacting in new ways. So you have to have that potential for a system to evolve. The second thing you have to have is that there's some kind of process, either natural or in some cases artificial, by which you generate many, many different configurations. You sample that huge configuration space that's out there. And then finally, some configurations that possess improved function are selected. There's a selection for function. You select because some configurations work, whereas most configurations don't work. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of evolving systems. And each one of these, I want you to think to yourself, okay, there's building blocks that come together. There's a potential for a lot of different configurations. There's some natural process that samples lots of configurations, and then there's selection. And the first one I want to talk to you about is minerals, mineral evolution. So think about minerals. They're the oldest things you can hold in your hand. There are certain meteorites you can hold in your hand that are 4.6 billion years old. So they preserve information, and they tell the stories of the evolution and the origin of planets. And every specimen, if you think about it, is like a time capsule just waiting to be opened. It's information rich. So mineral evolution, which is an idea I introduced in 2008, is simply the idea of looking at minerals as having a history, and then you can understand changing diversity and distribution of minerals as a consequence of new processes coming into play in a planetary environment. Some of them are chemical, some of them are physical, and ultimately biological processes make minerals. So these papers came out and they describe how minerals change through time. And our basic premise is that you can see a sequence of change. Before I go too much into depth, I've got to give you a definition which may sound a little strange. A mineral species, we think about species of animals and plants, but the minerals have a formal definition of species introduced by the International Mineralogical Association. A mineral species has an idealized crystal structure. It has to be a naturally occurring crystal, and it has to have an idealized composition. So, for example, here's a crystal of quartz. The composition ideally is SiO2. Pure SiO2 does not exist, but that's the way we idealize it. It has the idealized quartz structure. And every combination of a crystal structure and a composition is a species. There are about 6,000 approved species right now, each one representing a unique combination of structure and chemistry. So, mineral evolution thinks about the diversity of mineral species over time, the relative abundance of those, the compositional ranges, and that includes things like trace and minor elements, which always occur in a mineral specimen, and even things like sizes and shapes, which are not taken into account by the official mineral identification rules. We focus exclusively on near-surface processes, the upper 3 kilometers, and there's good reasons for that. That's where we have accessibility for studying on Earth. It's what we're going to see on other planets and moons. It's also where you have direct interaction with biology. Now, we could expand mineral evolution to deeper and deeper in the Earth, all the way down to the core if we wanted to, but the deeper we go, the less information we have. So the early stages of this effort have focused on the near-surface environment. I have to make a comment about the word evolution. When I first published the idea of mineral evolution, it was attacked vigorously, mostly by biologists who said, you're not allowed to use that word. They said biology is the only legitimate use and application of the word evolution. We strongly disagree because of several reasons. One, evolution, its most basic definition, is change over time, and it's been used in the geology literature for more than a century. For example, Norman Bowen's Evolution of the Igneous Rocks. It also implies complexification. There's a system that starts simply and gets more and more diverse and complex. And there's also this idea of congruency. Stage by stage by stage, you go through an evolutionary process, and you can't get to the second stage until you've already done the first stage and build on it. It does not mean this. Minerals do not evolve by Darwinian natural selection, so erase this from your mind. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so the idea of mineral evolution, new minerals form because of physical, chemical, and ultimately biological processes. We talk about 10 different stages of mineral evolution, which can be shown graphically, and I'm just going to run you through those to give you a sense of what we mean. So the earliest stage of mineral evolution are actually minerals formed, in some cases, billions of years before our solar system in the atmospheres of stars, literally stardust. When a star gets old, its gaseous envelope expands and cools, and there are certain elements like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, magnesium, silicon that can condense little crystals. These are microscopic crystals at very, very high temperatures. And there are about 25 of these earliest minerals, micro and nano minerals, stardust, that still fall to Earth in meteorites. And we can identify them because they have very distinctive properties. And they contain about 12 different elements. And the question of mineral evolution then becomes, how do you go from 25 minerals with 12 essential elements before Earth actually forms to what we see on Earth today, which is more than 6,000 different mineral species. So that's the mineral evolution story. As I say, there's 10 stages. Stage 1 is the earliest condensates in the solar nebula. Before there were any planets, The heating of the sun caused little droplets to melt and then freeze, and when it froze, you get this little suite of about 90 different mineral species. Chondrite meteorites, if any of you collect meteorites, these little circular devices, those are the actual droplets from the earliest period of the solar system. Then those chondrites came together to form planetesimals. The planetesimals, that they got to 50 or 100 or 200 kilometers, begin to melt. The iron and nickel go to the core to make a metallic core. The surrounding mantle is made of silicate minerals. Those are the achondrite meteorites that fall to Earth. So they have a bunch of their primary minerals, and then there's aqueous alteration, there's thermal alteration, and there's alteration by impacts. And all of those minerals together represent about 300 different mineral species that fall to Earth even today as meteorites. All those meteorites are like 4.5 or more billion years old. Stage 3 is the formation of the earliest planets. And if you have a dry world like the Moon or Mercury, we think that the endpoint probably is those same 300 meteorite minerals. There's not a lot of other minerals you're going to form in a near-surface environment in a dry world. However, if you have a wet world, you can form a whole bunch of hydroxides and clay minerals and ices and other sorts of things because of water-rock interaction. And we think that that probably is the endpoint of Mars, about 450 different minerals. And we're testing that with the Mars rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance and so forth right now. So that's stage 3. Stage 4, on Earth, you have a large enough planet that the very first minerals that come to the surface in the form of a black rock called basalt. Basalt can be remelted, and when it does, it produces a very buoyant liquid that rises to the surface and forms granites. Granites which make our continents. And the granites contain hundreds and hundreds of new minerals, maybe about 1,000 new mineral species in all, primarily in what are called pegmatites, which collectors love. Stage 5 on Earth is the result of plate tectonics, because water-rock interaction with plate tectonics occurs at a huge scale. Hundreds of millions of cubic kilometers of the crust and the upper mantle get reworked. There's new kinds of volcanism that results. We have ore deposits form, we have mountain building, we have all kinds of high pressure minerals that come to the surface. And so that gives us about 3,500 minerals in all. And those are purely physical and chemical processes. However, we have 6,000 minerals on Earth today, and so one of the first things we had to ask is, well, how in the world do you get to 6,000 minerals when we only can get 3,500 through purely physical and chemical processes? And the answer, of course, is life. Life is incredibly important in the diversification of minerals on Earth's surface. Stage 6, the first stage in which life plays a big role, has to do with microbes that basically lived at or near the surface and used the chemical potential of rocks that were formed deep in the Earth. Those happen to be called reduced. Think of them as being the electron-rich part of your battery. And so those are just sitting there. The electrons are ready to be moved off into the atmosphere. And so minerals will form anyway. But microbes say, oh, look, there's an energy source. They plug themselves into the rocks. The electrons flow through the microbes. And you can make the same minerals you would have formed anyway, but you make them in entirely new forms and new ways much more rapidly. So that's stage 6. It's the period before photosynthesis. Stage 7, this is what might be called in the evolution community a punctuation event, and a very astounding increase in the number of minerals because of a change in the atmosphere, oxygen. And when you put oxygen in the atmosphere, you can basically create all sorts of new minerals, like rusting iron. But this occurs, for example, with copper minerals. If you know copper minerals, those beautiful blue and green minerals, those are all oxidized forms of copper. Hundreds of minerals, about 2/3 of all the known copper minerals, this sort. Uranium, about 90% of all the uranium minerals are the result of atmospheric oxygenation, and hundreds of others. So all these colorful minerals arise through biological mediation. They're not formed by microbes, but they're formed as an indirect result of the changes that life brings. Stage 8 is a very long period in Earth history, about 1 billion years, when the oceans were oxygenated at the top, but very reduced, had no oxygen at the bottom. And it took that long for oxygen to basically filter all the way down and oxygenate the oceans from top to bottom. There was a stage 9, which is the period in which ice, there we go, ice was the dominant mineral at Earth's surface. By some models, there were repeated periods when the entire globe, from the poles all the way to the equator, were covered in a layer of ice. These snowball Earth events really changed Earth in dramatic ways. They cycled through huge fluctuations from being very cold to very, very hot and back again. And as I say, ice was a major mineral. And then came the Phanerozoic period of biomineralization, the last 500, 600 million years or so, which was represented by all sorts of things. Of course, life came onto land, and there were new kinds of shells and teeth and bones that were formed through minerals, other kinds of indirect formation of minerals. Hundreds of minerals formed in association with coal and various kinds of plant decay. And I just have to share one story with you about trilobites, which I've collected. This is the first trilobite I ever collected in Silicon, Ohio. I mentioned that to some of you in the Fossil Club back in when I was maybe 8 years old. And each of those little eye facets in this case has been replaced to a iron sulfide, which is just amazing to me, the whole thing. But trilobite eyes, they've now been studied. You can find trilobites that preserve the original crystal lenses. And those lenses are made of a mineral called calcite, calcium carbonate. And it's astonishing. Each lens is a single crystal, and it has what's known as the C crystallographic axis pointing at you, just like this. Every one of those lenses. But there's a problem, because calcite is a terrible material with which to make a lens. Red and blue light bend differently in calcite. So everything is out of focus. But what does evolution do? Evolution finds a way to correct for this chromatic aberration. If you look at a trilobite lens and analyze it, as scientists from the University of Chicago have done, you go from the middle of the lens to the outside, it's zoned compositionally. So that radially, as you go from the middle to the outside, there's a change in the ratio of calcium to magnesium. And that change in the ratio of calcium to magnesium corrects for chromatic aberration. It's just astonishing. But as you'll see, what evolution does is it finds solution. It selects for things that work. It rejects things that don't work. And so this becomes not a chance, random, wondrous miracle thing. It becomes, that's the way evolution works. And that's what our missing law proposes to describe. So a conclusion about mineral evolution, which has been a big part of my life for the last couple of decades, is that you can see Earth's surface has changed dramatically in terms of its mineralogy. You have a sequence of new mineral forming processes, some of which are biological, and that life really is a major factor. What I didn't anticipate when we did this is a new way to frame mineralogy for educational purposes. And I take you back to my childhood once again, because when I was young, my family moved to the New York City area, and I began to be an incredible fan of the American Museum of Natural History. Museums have played a huge role in my love of science and my career path. And so the American Museum of Natural History had the Morgan Hall of Gem and Minerals. It had these row upon row of cases of minerals arranged by chemistry and structure. Chemistry and structure. You had the native elements, you had the sulfides, you had the sulfosalts, you had the halides. You went through. Every specimen was labeled with a name of a mineral, a chemical formula, a crystal system, and the location in which it was found. No age information, no information about how the mineral was formed, but that was the way things were done. I love those minerals. I have vivid memories of favorite specimens. Imagine how I felt about 3 years ago when the new Hall of Gem and Minerals at the American Museum of Natural History was opened by my friend and colleague George Harlow. And he reorganized that magnificent collection according to mineral evolution. And so now the exact same specimens I saw when I was a child and learned are now organized by when they formed, how they formed. We still have the structure and the composition information, but there's the story behind them. The whole sweep of Earth history is told by this, and many other museums are doing this. That's really exciting. Okay, that's minerals. When I mentioned evolution, you probably first thought of Charles Darwin and the evolution of life. And Darwin indeed had a theory, a model of evolution. And what he said, very simply, was that individuals in a population display variations. Look around this room. Every one of us is different. We're all humans, but we all have our distinct characteristics. He said that more individuals are born than survive, and that's certainly true in the wild. Not so much in human populations now because we have such great medical science, but to be born and survive long enough to reproduce, and those favorable traits are then selected and passed on to offspring. And so Darwin looked at natural systems like the birds in the Galapagos, and he realized that here are all these birds that were certainly related to each other in some way, but the beaks are wildly different depending on what food source was available on each of the different Galapagos islands, whether you had nuts or berries or insects or other sorts of nutrients. And you can do this kind of diagram for all sorts of things. Here's a shark evolution diagram. And because of the incredible work by paleontologists, both professionals and vocational around the world, we have more and more information about these kinds of evolutionary trees, and we see how Darwin's ideas worked. They worked because you can see selection going on from one stage to the next. You try lots of different genetic configurations. Some of them work, most of them don't, and evolution works in that way. And in case you haven't ever seen this, I have to share a computer simulation of eye evolution from about 30 years ago. Very early computer simulation of evolution. Darwin himself said, of what use is half an eye? How do you go from a sightless animal to an animal that has a fully functional eye? He went on to say, well, if each step of the process gives you some advantage, then that's how it works. And that's what the creationists always leave out. So, but Darwin showed that if you start with a creature that has just a flat back, just think of this as a worm that has a few light-sensitive cells on its back, which is very common. There are lots of light-sensitive cells. So the gray bar, that's the light-sensitive part. The white part is transparent cells, and the black part is just the substrate in which those cells live. And this computer simulation said, okay, let's change three things. We're going to randomly change three aspects of this configuration by plus or minus 1%. So you change the curvature. It can be curved outward, it can be curved inward. You change the aperture, that's the distance between the two ends. And you can change what's called the refractive index. That's the amount to which that white part bends light. And if those 1% random changes confers an advantage, if you can see better, if your visual acuity improves, then you preserve that change. That's the only thing. And then you just let it run. After a couple hundred steps, invariably it starts to have a curved pit. And the reason is because when you have a curved pit, you can tell the direction from which a shadow is coming. And if you're a predator or a prey, that can be pretty useful to know where that moving thing is. After about 1,000 steps, that curved pit becomes a spherical one. And in fact, this is almost the exact geometry of the eye of a limpet, I am told. Okay, so that's pretty amazing. In 1,000 steps, you've gone from a flat, light-sensitive surface to an eye. But wait, there's more, because you can change the index of refraction, and so automatically in this program, the index of refraction starts changing. You start creating a primitive lens, and then you start closing the aperture and making a slightly better lens. And after 2,000 steps, 2,000 clicks. Okay, there we go. You end up with this, which given the initial configuration is the absolute optimal eye. You couldn't engineer a better eye. It has the perfect focal length, that is the perfect focus, everything about it works perfectly. Every time you run this simulation, even though the random steps are different, the end point is always evolved because you're selecting for something that works, and it turns out there's only one configuration that works best. So that's what gets selected for. So that's Darwin. That's what Darwin was talking about, step by step. Well, of course, engineers have now used this in a very dramatic way in computer-aided evolution called genetic algorithms. This is sort of the precursor to some of the AI things that are going on right now. So the last time you flew in a jet aircraft, the wings were designed by computer because they know hydrodynamics, they know aerodynamics, and you basically can say, let's keep sampling different configurations and see which ones work, and then let's mutate those configurations and see what works better and what works better. To me, my favorite example is the NASA ST-5 spacecraft antenna. Look this up on Wikipedia if you've never heard of it. It's an amazing story. This thing's just about 3 inches tall. NASA wanted to have an extremely lightweight, efficient antenna that when you send a spacecraft into deep space, it can radiate a signal efficiently in all directions. And this is a very, very tricky problem, but they know exactly the mathematics of antennas. So for any given antenna configuration, you can calculate how it works. And you're able to take a computer that starts with a wire that's just slightly bent. That's all they did. And then they just kept modifying it. They kept mutating and mutating it. They ended up with these crazy 5 kinks. They also challenged a group of antenna specialists to design their best. And this worked significantly better, 20% better than anything that human engineers could come up to with on their own, just simply through a genetic algorithm. That was a kind of Darwinian algorithm. All right, so there's another example. Lots and lots of different configurations. You generate them by computer. You select the ones that are going to work best. And then when you build the thing, it turns out it works. Okay. This works for material culture, too. I spent some of my earlier years playing trumpet, and some of the things we did historic reproductions of the Baroque period with natural trumpets, just a long brass tube, has a mouthpiece at one end, a bell at the other, and just a long tube, and it's like a bugle. You can play a bunch of notes, but not all of them. People got sort of tired of that in the orchestra. They wanted to be able to play more, so they tried something called a keyed bugle for a time, about a 50-year period when, sort of like saxophone or clarinet keys on the side, but it didn't have a great sound, but at least it played more notes, more of the intermediate notes. And then once steam engine technology came along, they were able to build airtight metal valves, and that's what the modern trumpet is. So here's an evolutionary process. You have many, many different configurations of tubes and mouthpieces and bells and so forth. Some of them work, most of them don't. And you keep trying different things, and they keep getting better and better and better because people sample new configurations. And one last example, if you'll forgive me. I'm fascinated by Broadway musicals, and here again is an example where you can put notes and singing and dancing together in all different configurations, and some work better than others. So here's a variety show on Broadway from the 1920s. People paid money to go see this. But then, of course, things evolve, and you have new configurations. So Carousel, this used classical ballet with, of course, the brilliant musical score. That was met with a lot of competition by jazz dancing, which was also introduced into Broadway musicals right around World War II. Some Kiss Me Kate. And one additional evolutionary step, if you don't mind, the West Side Story, which combines ballet, jazz, and the incredible musical score of Leonard Bernstein and Jerome Robbins' choreography. So, all of these systems, I would argue, are conceptually equivalent, as different as they may seem on the surface. Every one of them has the potential to adopt vast numbers of different configurations. Every one of them has processes by which you can generate different configurations, whether it's the human mind or a computer or nature, by mixing up atoms to make minerals or mixing up genes to make new living creatures. And finally, certain configurations possess enhanced function. They're preferentially selected. Minerals that are stable and don't fall apart are preferentially selected. Living things that can pass their genes on to the next generation are preferentially selected. Broadway musicals that can sell tickets are preferentially selected. I mean, it's funny, but it's true. I mean, this is, it's what we buy. Okay. So finally, I've said that there are four things that a natural law should be able to do. One of them is describe. One of them is explain. One of them is predict and quantify. Those four things. So I've described a law to you, which I think describes and explains. But in order it to quantify and predict, we need to have a metric. And so what's the metric? And I think the answer is information. I think what has been missing is that information of a particular kind is as fundamental to our natural world as energy or mass or force. Information. We live in an information age, but this has not been obvious and forthcoming. The kind of information is one that was introduced more than 20 years ago by my colleague Jack Szostak, Nobel Prize winner in biology. Jack describes something called functional information, and then Jack and I, he applied it to a specific kind of biological information molecule called RNA, and then we applied it much more broadly in a subsequent paper. And the idea is very simple, that you have a configuration space, all the different possible configurations. You can think of those configurations of brass tubes to make trumpets, or configuration of musical notes to make Broadway musicals, or configurations of atoms to make minerals, whatever you have in your mind. And you can say that all this configuration of space, but only a tiny, tiny fraction of all those configurations actually works. It's a stable mineral. It's a Broadway musical that sells tickets. So you can think of that as a cone of possibilities, and as you demand more and more and more function, more and more excellence of survival, if you will, you have a smaller and smaller fraction of that whole cone of possibilities. And so there's a very simple equation, which I won't go into. It's just the negative log to the base 2 of that fraction. Base 2 gives you bits, zeros and ones. Minus log means that that very tiny fraction can be a very big number. So functional information increases as you have more and more and more demands on the selection for function. And here's our law. This is it. This is what we published in PNAS last October. The functional information of a system will increase as the system will evolve if many different configurations undergo selection for one or more functions. Now, we've actually tested this. We predicted that functional information has to increase. So without going into a lot of gory details, I'm happy to share the paper with you. We've done this in a paper that just came out a couple of months ago on mineral evolution, where we looked at the functional information on the vertical scale in bits of information versus those different stages that I just talked to you about on the horizontal. And you'll see this incredible increase. But what's even more interesting is, rather than just looking at stage by stage, because they're not equally spaced in time, let's space these according to the number of minerals that have been discovered through different stages. Remember that earliest stage of stellar minerals are only 25 minerals, and the functional information is rather low. We go to the chondrite stage and the meteorite stage and up and up and up till the estimate of the total number of mineral species on Earth today. And what do you see? You not only see an increase through time, but it's leveling off. And what that suggests to us is that mineral evolution is the example of a bounded evolving system. Functional information is increasing, it's getting more, it's reaching a limit. And there is, in fact, a limit, we think, to mineral evolution. That may be a profound difference from living systems, which may have open-ended evolution, and you'll never reach that limit. So there are implications. One of them that's very important and just baked into this is that both abiotic, that is non-living, and living systems display evolution. Minerals evolve, isotopes evolve, life evolves, trumpets evolve. It's consistent with all of those other laws of nature. It doesn't violate any of them, but it doesn't follow directly from those laws. It's something new and different. And then this leads us back to the question, what is time? And I would say as a scientist, there are two arrows of time. The first is the second law of thermodynamics, which describes an increase in entropy, an increase in disorder. It's part and parcel of every moment of our lives. It's there. We cannot escape it. It is a law. At the same time, we suggest that there's a second arrow of time, which is the law of increasing information, a law of increasing order. And in a sense, this balances the law of increasing disorder. They occur both. And if I might, I think we all know this is true. And you don't have to be a scientist to realize that in your life, there are two arrows of time. There's that arrow of increasing disorder, the second law of thermodynamics. And we cannot escape it. We have accidents, irreversible. That moment you were driving, you were distracted and something terrible happened. That thing that every one of us has said, that terrible thing that we wish we could take back, but you can't, because time is irreversible. It is so easy to destroy things. It is so easy because the second law is with us all the time. We are all getting older. We're all going to age. We are all going to die. We are all going to decay. We can't escape that. But there is a second arrow of time, which is an arrow of increasing order. And this is different. This law is different. It involves making choices. We can imagine in our minds different configurations of our lives. And we can select. You can smile at somebody. You can take care of someone. You can say something kind. We have those choices. And when we make those choices, we are part of the increasing functional information of the cosmos. Thank you.